The dust of the Grand Thalia Theater possessed a specific, almost carnivorous quality. It did not merely settle, it clung, absorbing light and muffling sound, creating a perpetual, suffocating twilight, even when the weak winter sun attempted to penetrate the high, grimy windows of the stage entrance. Elias, 11 years old and built of sharp angles and perpetual hunger, moved through this environment with the mechanical precision of a creature accustomed to invisibility. The current assignment, the one Mr. Cairn had delivered with a characteristic nasal grunt, was the deep scour of the main stage, an expanse of scarred oak that stretched 30 feet in either direction, appearing cavernous and intimidating under the lone, bare work lamp positioned high above the proscenium arch. Elias knelt, the raw hemp bristles of the large push-broom scoring the ancient wood. The friction created a low, persistent rasping sound that resonated in the vast, empty auditorium, a noise that spoke of solitude and forgotten applause. The air was cold, a deep, pervasive dampness that seeped past the thin wool of his borrowed trousers and chilled the very marrow of his bones. He could feel the familiar ache spreading across his lower back and settling into the tight cords of his hamstrings, a chronic companion to his labor. His hands, perpetually chapped and coated in a fine layer of pulverized wood and theatrical makeup residue, gripped the broom handle. Each sweep was meticulous, driven by the absolute necessity of perfection. Mr. Cairn tolerated no inefficiency, and Elias knew that a single missed corner, a stray cobweb left dangling from the fly rails, meant a reduction in the meager crust of bread and watery soup that constituted his evening meal. The consequence was immediate, physical, and intensely felt. He pushed the broom across a section of the stage, near where the curtain track met the floor, a zone perpetually neglected, a graveyard of lost costume buttons, dried-up paint, and the faint, sweet decay of old flowers. The wood here was darker, stained by decades of spilled stage blood and sweat. As he dragged the heavy broom back toward himself, the head snagged slightly, not on accumulated dirt, but on a subtle unevenness in the floor itself. He stopped, his breath freezing in the frigid air before him. The silence of the theater rushed in, pressing against his eardrums. He lowered the broom carefully, letting it rest against the polished apron of the stage, and then leaned forward, bringing his face close to the floorboards. The smell of dust and ancient varnish was overwhelming. Using the pads of his stiff fingers, he traced the outline of the obstruction. It was a single floorboard, marginally wider than its neighbors and slightly depressed. It had the distinct, almost imperceptible line of a subtle hinge or a seam that had swelled and settled unevenly over time. This section was about 3 feet long, located just where a stagehand might stand, waiting for a cue, a spot so mundane and overlooked it screamed of hidden purpose. A sudden, sharp spike of apprehension tightened his chest. Everything in Elias's life taught him that untouched, forgotten spaces in the Grand Thalia were best left undisturbed. They harbored rats, decay, and most threateningly, the potential to incur Mr. Cairn's volatile displeasure. Curiosity, however, a fragile, seldom indulged emotion, started to flutter beneath his ribs. He retrieved the small, blunt utility knife that Mr. Cairn allowed him to keep for cutting twine and scoring paint edges. The metal of the handle was painfully cold against his palm. He knelt again, positioning himself so the pale shaft of light from the high lamp grazed the suspect's seam, throwing the minutest shadows into stark relief. Elias inserted the very tip of the blade into the crevice. The seam resisted, coated by years of compressed dirt and wax. He wiggled the blade, applying slow, painstaking pressure, mindful not to snap the brittle tip. The effort required precision and a controlled tensing of his muscles. His lower lip was caught between his teeth, a habit he adopted when focusing intensely. He pressed the knife deeper, using the back of his hand as a fulcrum against the stage floor. He felt the resistance of a small, rusty latch or securing pin giving way under the sustained, careful pressure. Slowly, tentatively, the edge of the board began to rise, less than a millimeter, but enough to confirm his suspicion. This was a discreet, almost invisible stage trapdoor, designed for the rapid disappearance of props or actors during a theatrical illusion. Elias moved the knife aside and slid his fingertips beneath the now raised edge. The wood felt rough and dry. He pulled upward, applying only the necessary force. The hinges, protesting loudly with a thin, high squeal that seemed deafening in the silence of the theater, finally gave way. The board swung open, revealing a cavity roughly the size and depth of a small trunk. The air that rushed out of the opening was distinct, profoundly different from the theater's pervasive dust. It was heavy and still, smelling intensely of old, dried lavender, expensive moth deterrents, and the deep, musty sweetness of velvet that had been sealed away from light and movement for decades. Elias hesitated, the small flap of wood resting against the floor, creating a black, yawning mouth beneath the pale work-light. He glanced instinctively toward the shadowy wings of the stage, half expecting Mr. Cairn's heavy silhouette to materialize from the gloom drawn by the sound of the squealing hinge. Nothing, only the cold, persistent silence. He leaned over the opening, peering into the darkness. It was too deep for the stage light to penetrate fully. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and felt around the rim of the opening, his fingers brushing against rough, unfinished timber. He lowered his arm further, dipping into the cold, silent cavity. His fingers met something substantial, textile, and incredibly heavy. The texture was dense, yielding yet resistant, suggesting layered fabric. He took hold of the object. It was surprisingly large, folded tightly and oddly rigid. He pulled. The object rose slowly, scraping against the dry wood of the opening. It was heavier than any stage costume he had ever lifted. The sheer dead weight required him to use both hands and brace his elbows against his knees. As the bulk of the garment cleared the opening and slumped onto the dusty floor of the stage, the meager light caught it. Elias gasped, a small involuntary sound instantly swallowed by the vastness of the empty hall. He did not gasp from surprise, but from the sudden, overwhelming impact of impossible, cold opulence. It was a king's tunic, or perhaps a heavy, sleeveless surcoat, designed to be worn over armor or fine silks. The fabric was velvet, a midnight blue so deep it appeared black in the shadows, woven so tightly it seemed more like metal than cloth. But the fabric was merely the foundation for the surface detail. The entire garment was encrusted, not sewn with costume beads or colored glass, but overwhelmingly, irrevocably, with stones. Elias reached out a hesitant, trembling finger and touched the surface. The stones were cold, intensely cold, pulling the heat immediately from his skin. They were set densely, forming intricate swirling patterns across the chest, the high collar and the heavy drape of the shoulders. He leaned closer, trying to process the visual onslaught under the weak light. The majority of the stones were a dark, velvety blue. Sapphires, Elias realized with a sickening jolt of comprehension. They were not polished, perfect cabochons, but deep, multifaceted cuts, each one catching the faint light and fracturing it into microscopic shards of indigo. They were set shoulder to shoulder, creating a continuous, shimmering and terrifying mosaic of wealth. Interspersed among the blue, creating a dizzying contrast, were large scattered jewels that looked like droplets of congealed fire. Rubies. These were cut flatter, wider, reflecting the light in a deep, viscous crimson. Where the sapphires were cold and distant, the rubies were fiercely present, burning against the cool velvet, and surrounding the complex patterns of color, forming borders and highlighting the central crest on the chest, were the colorless stones, diamonds. They weren't polished to a brilliant modern sparkle. Instead, they had the slightly yellowish, antique glow of very old, perfectly cut stones, each one a tiny mirror reflecting the grim stage light. Elias had seen theatrical costumes before, gaudy, over-the-top outfits intended to read as rich from the back row. They were always light, often flimsy, employing metallic threads and carefully placed rhinestones. This object was the antithesis of stagecraft. It was weighted, utterly real, and radiated an oppressive sense of history and genuine, dangerous value. He lifted a corner of the velvet. The garment was stiff, perhaps preserved with age or the sheer density of the settings. The fabric underneath the stones felt thick, woven with fine, heavy gold thread that made the blue look richer, deeper. The physical reality of the object hit him hard. This was not a prop. This was something real, secreted away, something that belonged to a history far removed from the dusty, failing Thalia Theater. The implications flooded his mind with paralyzing speed. Finding this was not merely finding money. It was finding a mountain of concentrated, undisguised risk. This was the kind of object people killed for, the kind of object that could change his life in a single heartbeat, or end it just as quickly if the wrong person knew he possessed it. He knelt there, paralyzed, the heavy velvet ruff against his knees. The costume rested on the wooden stage, reflecting the miserable light, looking utterly misplaced, like a fragment of a dead star fallen onto the grime of earth. He had to move. The weight of the secret felt immediately crushing, heavier than the tunic itself. Elias quickly scanned the stage again. His heart was now pounding a frantic, irregular rhythm against his ribs, generating a dull, internal thumping sound that seemed amplified in the silence. The intense alert he felt was visceral, danger, immediate, overwhelming. He had to get the garment back into the hole quickly and seal the trapdoor. He tried to lift the whole costume. It was impossible. The weight of the stones made it incredibly unwieldy, like trying to lift a chainmail shirt woven with boulders. The jewels clinked faintly against each other, a low metallic whisper of immense value. He had to refold it. Elias carefully grasped the rigid collar and began to manipulate the heavy garment. He treated it with an exaggerated, almost reverential caution, afraid of disturbing the delicate, intricate settings of the stones, afraid of breaking the spell of its age. As he folded the stiff velvet, his fingers traced the cool, hard surface of a large, teardrop-shaped sapphire embedded near the shoulder. He felt the sharpness of the cut edges, the smooth, raised setting that held it firmly in place. This specific stone was the size of his thumb joint, and its coldness seemed to penetrate his skin, reaching the bone. He managed to fold the garment roughly into a tight, rectangular bundle. The smell of lavender and age grew stronger. He pushed the heavy bundle back into the cavity. It slid into the tight space with difficulty, settling with a deep, muffled thump. Elias then reached for the stage board. The wood was stiff, but he guided it back into place, aligning the seam perfectly. He leaned on it with his full weight. It settled back into its depressed position. He pressed the seam closed again, using the blunt edge of the utility knife to scrape dust and compressed dirt back into the hairline gap. He worked with a feverish intensity, his movements rapid yet precise, driven by a desperate need to erase all evidence of the discovery. When he was done, the spot was exactly as it had been 5 minutes earlier, an uneven, dark board, distinguished only by its subtle misplacement from its neighbors. He stood up slowly, stretching his aching back, but the physical pain was utterly overshadowed by the roaring, anxious energy now coursing through his veins. The discovery was a screaming reality locked beneath the wooden stage. He picked up the broom again, but his cleaning movements were now merely a simulation of labor. He swept in broad, meaningless arcs, listening intently. The stage lights in the Thalia were temperamental, prone to sudden electrical buzzing, but tonight the cold had silenced even that usual background noise. The silence amplified every distant sound, the creak of the aging pipes in the walls, the faint, erratic drumming of rain starting on the vast tin roof, and most terrifyingly, the almost subliminal sound of heavy boots moving on the concrete floor far below the stage, near the backstage storage area. Mr. Cairn. Elias froze, broom mid-sweep. The sound was too faint to confirm location, but the weight and rhythm were unmistakable. Cairn was approaching, ascending the stairs from the cellar storage, likely coming to perform one of his abrupt, silent inspections. The intense alert level in Elias's mind spiked to panic. If Cairn saw the sweat on his brow, the wild, unfocused energy in his eyes, or worse, noticed the slightest disturbance on the stage floor, the consequences would be severe. Cairn had an unnerving ability to detect deviation, to smell fear like a predator. Elias forced himself to breathe slowly, deeply, pushing the frantic pounding of his heart down into his stomach. He resumed sweeping, adopting a slow, monotonous, deliberately bored pace. He made sure the broom covered the area near the trapdoor, scattering fresh layers of dust and erasing any potential smudges left by his hands or the heavy costume. The footsteps grew louder, now muffled by the heavy velvet curtain that separated the stage wings from the backstage corridor. Elias heard the heavy huff of breath and the familiar sound of a large hand pushing aside the thick curtain fabric. Mr. Cairn stepped onto the stage wing. He was a large man, built like a sack of grain, always wearing the same thick, ill-fitting tweed coat that smelled faintly of stale tobacco and institutional cleanser. His face was jowly and perpetually set in an expression of grudging disapproval. Cairn did not look directly at Elias. He surveyed the stage, his gaze sweeping across the freshly scrubbed wood with the cold detachment of a quality controller. "You've missed the corner, boy." Cairn's voice was a low, abrasive rumble that seemed to vibrate the floorboards. "Near the cyclorama wall, I see the dust line." Elias did not argue. He merely nodded, keeping his eyes on the floor, adopting the posture of utter subservience. He pivoted the broom and walked toward the far corner of the stage, near the enormous, curved white backdrop used for projections. The silence while Cairn watched him was thick, oppressive. Elias could feel the man's heavy presence like a physical weight on his shoulders. He concentrated fiercely on the action of sweeping, ignoring the trembling that threatened to seize his arms. He had to appear entirely consumed by the mundane task of dirt removal. Cairn finally shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking. He took 2 steps onto the main stage, walking directly toward the spot where the jewel-encrusted tunic lay hidden, separated from him by a mere half-inch of ancient oak. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He felt a sudden, sickening flush of heat rush over his face, instantly battling the cold air. Cairn stopped directly over the trapdoor. He reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver flask. He uncorked it with a sharp pop and took a long, noisy sip of whatever bitter liquid he kept inside. Elias waited, every nerve ending screaming. The proximity of the theater manager to the incredible secret felt like a taut, strained wire ready to snap. Cairn cleared his throat, a deep, phlegmy sound. "The owner is coming next week," he announced, replacing the flask and surveying the empty auditorium. "Mr. Silverton. He wants to discuss demolition. He says the Thalia is a fire hazard and a blight. You'll be working through the night, Elias. Every stitch of fabric, every piece of old rope must be catalogued and cleared." The pronouncement of demolition hammered home the urgency. The theater, Elias's cold, dusty, miserable sanctuary, was about to vanish, and with it, his access to the hidden treasure. Cairn finally turned away from the trapdoor, giving the stage a last dismissive look. "Don't stop until the wood is smooth enough to ice skate on, boy. I'll check again before dawn, and if I find a single speck of failure—" He trailed off, the implicit threat hanging heavy in the air. Cairn walked back toward the curtain, his heavy tread receding into the backstage corridor. Elias listened until the sound of the footsteps died away entirely, replaced by the persistent drumming of the rain on the roof. He leaned against the cyclorama wall, suddenly weak, sinking slowly down until he was sitting on the floor, oblivious to the damp and dirt. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, and he realized he had been holding his breath for the entire duration of Cairn's inspection. The knowledge of the costume beneath the floor was now an intense, immediate pressure. Demolition meant workers, heavy machinery, and the systematic dismantling of the stage itself. The trapdoor, subtle as it was, would inevitably be discovered by professionals trained to look for structural anomalies. He had hours, perhaps less than a week, before the theatre was swarming with people who would find the treasure he had stumbled upon. If they found it, they would take it, and Elias would not only gain nothing, but would likely be suspected of concealing it initially. He had to retrieve it, and he had to do it immediately. Elias waited 10 excruciating minutes, ensuring Cairn was safely occupied or gone. He then rose, retrieving his utility knife and moving back to the trapdoor. The single lamp above the stage cast long dancing shadows, now that the wind had picked up outside, rattling the loose glass in the high windows. The stage felt like a vessel adrift, the silence vast and menacing. He pried open the trapdoor again, the hinges screaming their complaint in the silence. The scent of lavender and aged velvet rose again, intoxicating and alarming. This time, Elias did not pull the costume out entirely. He needed to get it to his tiny hidden living space, a small dark cupboard beneath the stage manager's box, tucked away high in the auditorium, accessible only through a precarious ladder and a series of forgotten maintenance tunnels. He plunged his hands into the cavity. The garment was cold. He pulled the bundled tunic halfway out, resting the massive, heavy thing on the edge of the opening. He now had to examine the object thoroughly enough to understand its true nature and, more importantly, figure out the safest way to transport it. He couldn't carry this jewel-encrusted burden through the public areas of the theatre. The weight alone was prohibitive. He unfolded the tunic slightly, revealing the collar. The collar was exceptionally high and rigid, decorated entirely with small, close-set pearls, not the milky modern kind, but the slightly irregular, creamy white pearls that spoke of deep antiquity. They were surrounded by thin lines of interwoven gold wire. The primary focus, the massive cluster of sapphires and rubies across the chest, was mesmerizing. Elias brought his face close, observing the workmanship. The stones were set into the velvet itself, secured with fine, claw-like gold prongs. The complexity suggested not just wealth, but an artist's obsessive devotion. He recognized the style faintly, having sneaked glances at history books left abandoned in the theatre office. It looked like something from the late medieval or early Renaissance era, designed not for comfort, but for absolute, overwhelming display of power. He ran his hand cautiously over a massive cluster of 5 large rubies, arranged like a 5-pointed star. These rubies were startlingly large, each one easily the size of a pigeon's egg. The red was deep, intense, almost black in the weak light, only revealing its bloody true color when he tilted the fabric. The setting was thick, almost brutally functional, holding the stones immobile against the velvet. The weight was extraordinary. If he estimated the sheer volume of the stones, this garment likely weighed close to 40 pounds. 40 pounds of solid gold settings and precious minerals. Elias realized he could not carry this. He was small, frail, and already exhausted. The task of hauling this rigid, heavy garment up the steep, narrow ladder to his hiding spot was impossible. Any sudden noise, any drop, would expose him instantly. He had to lighten the load. The thought of separating the stones from the fabric sent a wave of genuine horror through him. It felt like an act of desecration, a destruction of a priceless artifact. But the urgency of the situation superseded all reverence. The item was useless to him and catastrophically dangerous in its current integrated form. Survival mandated breaking it down. He looked around desperately for tools. He only had the blunt utility knife. That would not suffice for prying out large, intricately set jewels. He remembered the old, forgotten tool chest in the scenic workshop, tucked away in the deepest part of the backstage warren. It was full of old woodworking and construction implements, pliers, hammers, wrenches, and critically, a set of fine jeweler's screwdrivers left behind by a visiting production 15 years ago, instruments used for repairing delicate stage props. The scenic workshop was located on the opposite side of the stage, down a long, echoing corridor. The journey required leaving the relative safety of the stage apron and venturing deeper into the cold, dark labyrinth of the theatre. Elias replaced the costume into the trapdoor cavity, sealing the board tightly shut again, securing the secret until his return. He grabbed his coat, a thin, threadbare thing, and pulled it tightly around his shoulders. He moved silently across the stage, gliding on the balls of his feet. Every step was calculated to avoid the slightest creak of the old wood. He reached the backstage corridor. The air here was colder still, funneling down from the roof. He hugged the wall, melting into the shadows, his senses straining for any sign of Cairn. He heard nothing but the persistent rain and the mournful groan of the theatre structure settling in the cold. The scenic workshop door was heavy, made of fire-resistant metal, and thankfully did not squeak. He slid inside. The room was dominated by the smell of turpentine and sawdust. It was utterly dark. Elias felt along the wall for the emergency light switch, finding the cold brass plate. He flipped it. A single, dusty, fluorescent tube flickered overhead, bathing the room in a sickly, green-tinged light. He found the tool chest on a low workbench, covered in a thick blanket of sawdust. He lifted the lid. The interior smelled of old machine oil and rust. He plunged his hands inside, rummaging through the cold, sharp implements. He found them, a small, leather-bound pouch, stained and stiff, containing a set of miniature, specialized tools. He pulled them out. 3 tiny screwdrivers with flat, fine heads, perfect for manipulating small prongs, and a pair of needle-nose pliers, ideal for delicate gripping. He tucked the pouch inside his trousers, ensuring the metal tools did not clink against each other. He left the workshop as silently as he had entered and retraced his steps. The urgency had intensified with the realization of the demolition deadline. He was now operating under the pressure of a ticking clock, every passing minute narrowing his window of opportunity. Back at the stage, he opened the trap door for the 3rd time. He pulled the costume out and dragged it slightly into the light. He sat down on the dusty floor, the heavy bundle resting carefully in his lap. He felt a profound sense of isolation and purpose. He was about to dismantle history to secure his future. He opened the tool pouch. His hands, though still shaking slightly from adrenaline, steadied as they gripped the fine tools, the familiar feeling of intricate manual labor asserting itself. He selected the smallest flathead screwdriver. He focused first on the collar, intending to remove the less valuable but highly visible pearls. The settings were ancient, the gold prongs stiff and brittle with age. He slid the flat tip of the screwdriver carefully beneath the first prong, holding a small, creamy pearl. He applied slow, even pressure. Ping! The prong lifted slightly. He repeated the action on the opposite side. He then used the needle-nose pliers, gripping the pearl gently, rotating it until it separated from the fabric. The pearl dropped into his palm, a small, cool sphere, utterly dull under the stage light. He found a discarded thick linen sack, once used for storing heavy stage weights, tucked beneath a prop table. It was heavy, durable, and would serve as his temporary storage. He continued his work with agonizing slowness. Each pearl had 4 prongs. Each prong had to be carefully lifted. The process demanded minute attention and absolute stillness. After an hour, Elias had cleared the entire collar and the borders of the chest crest. The pile of dull white pearls in the sack was considerable. The collar, now bare, looked ragged and deflated, the midnight blue velvet scarred by the marks where the gold settings had rested. He moved onto the serious task, the sapphires and rubies. He chose a section near the hem of the tunic, less visible than the chest. These stones were massive, secured by much thicker, heavier prongs of gold. He switched to the largest screwdriver. He inserted the tip, but the gold was rigid. He had to use significantly more force. Crrrk, a faint, terrifying sound of metal bending under duress. The prong gave way. Elias worked on the 4 prongs holding the first sapphire, which was cut into a perfect square. The stone was deep, heavy, and radiated coldness. He lifted the sapphire. It was breathtaking, large, square, deeply cut. It absorbed the light and held it captive. It felt like holding a fragment of frozen night. He dropped it into the sack. It landed with a heavy thud against the pile of pearls. The weight was instantly noticeable. The dismantling became a gruesome, relentless task of extraction. Elias worked for 3 more hours, the adrenaline slowly giving way to pure, crushing exhaustion. His fingers were cramping, his eyes burning from the focus and the strained light. His concentration was absolute, punctuated only by the low, grating sounds of metal on metal and the occasional soft thud as another irreplaceable jewel dropped into the canvas sack. He focused on the largest, most valuable stones, starting with the heavy clusters and the dominant rubies. The rubies were the most challenging. The gold settings seemed to have been forged specifically for their large, heavy dimensions. He had to brace the costume against the wooden floor, pressing down with his elbow to counter the force needed to bend the thick prongs. Sweat was beading on his forehead, a combination of the intense focus and the fear of failure. He worked through the central design. The sack grew heavy, the weight shifting with every movement. Elias periodically stopped, closing his eyes, listening, imagining Cairn's return. The costume was slowly turning into a ragged ruin. Where intricate patterns had once gleamed, now there were only frayed holes and bent gold wires clinging to the tattered velvet. The transformation was unsettling. It was moving from a king's vestment to a scrap of junk, its wealth contained entirely in the heavy linen bag resting beside Elias. He estimated he had extracted perhaps 2/3 of the total stones, the most significant, the highest volume pieces. The smaller stones, thousands of them forming the dense background lattice, would take days, time he did not possess. He had to stop. The sack was already dangerously heavy, containing wealth beyond his ability to comprehend, and the morning was fast approaching. He sealed the small tool pouch and then tightly knotted the heavy linen sack. The combined weight felt like holding a cobblestone. The stage was silent, the lone work lamp buzzing faintly now. The light outside the high windows was beginning to shift from black to a deep, bruised indigo, the harbinger of dawn. Elias looked at the shredded velvet tunic remaining on the stage. He could not leave the evidence there. He folded the remaining garment back into a tight bundle, ensuring none of the remaining smaller stones caught the light. He then picked up the heavy sack of jewels. He lifted the trapdoor one last time. He placed the heavy, bare velvet carcass of the king's costume back into the cavity, pushing it deep into the darkness, burying the evidence of the royal disguise and the physical act of its disassembly. He sealed the trapdoor, scattering dust across the seam one last time. The weight of the sack was alarming. He could barely lift it without straining. He slipped his arm through the reinforced handle of the sack, allowing it to hang heavy against his side, partially hidden by his coat. The hardest part remained, ascending to his sanctuary. He moved silently into the wings and found the rusted, precarious ladder that led to the maintenance tunnel above the auditorium ceiling. The ladder was vertical, narrow, and coated in oily grime. Elias tested the first rung. It groaned softly. With the heavy sack pulling against his shoulder, he began his ascent. Each upward pull required immense effort. The sack swung dangerously, threatening to throw him off balance on the narrow rungs. The jewels inside shifted, their combined weight a constant dense drag. He climbed slowly, painstakingly, rung by agonizing rung. The tunnel opening, a black square high above, seemed impossibly distant. He focused entirely on the movement. Left foot, right hand, pull, lift, breathe. The cold metal of the rungs bit into his hands, but the fear of dropping the sack was a more effective motivator than pain. Elias then pulled himself through the opening, collapsing into the tight, dusty space of the tunnel. He was now in the narrow space above the auditorium's false ceiling. The air here was stale and hot, trapped by the high roof, smelling of dry wood and old electrical wiring. He crawled the last few feet to his hiding spot, a small, closet-like space tucked behind a junction box, barely large enough for him to curl into. He pushed the heavy sack of jewels deep into the corner of the cupboard, covering it with a mound of old, stiff theater programs he used as a rudimentary mattress. He sat back, leaning against the cold wall, panting, utterly drained. It was done. The treasure was moved. The external danger of Mr. Cairn finding the trapdoor was mitigated, though the danger of the incoming demolition remained. The internal realization of what he had done, dismantled a historical artifact of immense value, was finally catching up to him. He was no longer an invisible, struggling orphan. He was a keeper of a devastating secret, a custodian of cold, silent fortune. He reached out in the darkness and touched the canvas sack. The weight was solid, grounding, yet terrifying. He pressed his palm against the rough fabric, feeling the subtle shapes of the massive stones within. He had removed the jewels, but they were still heavy, imposing their presence upon him. The cold of the sapphires, the silent fire of the rubies, the immense crushing responsibility of that weight now rested solely on Elias's small 11-year-old shoulders, deep within the dark, echoing heart of the dying Grand Thalia Theater. The rising sun, now filtering weak, grey light through the maintenance vent high above, marked the start of a new, perilous day, irrevocably altered by the cold, heavy reality hidden in the linen sack. The dramatic urgency was not over, it had merely shifted, focusing now on the desperate need for security and the terrifying realization that this vast fortune required a world he did not yet understand, a world far beyond the dusty, forgotten confines of the stage. He was awake, intensely alert, burdened by the silent consequence of his discovery.